Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining today's webinar on ESG risk in the enterprise, focused on the governance. Before I hand it over to our speakers to introduce themselves, I'll cover a couple of housekeeping items. First, we will be recording today's webinar, and it will be available on onetrust.com/resources in the near future. Second, everyone has joined the webinar muted. If you have any questions during the discussion, please feel free to enter them in the Q&A window at the bottom of your screen. I'll hand it over to Phil and Michael to get things kicked off.
Thank you, Megan. And thank you, everybody, for joining us today, wherever you are. Really appreciate you. This is third in our series of ESG risk in the enterprise. In the last two sessions, we focused on, of course, the environmental risk and the ramifications around what that means to your organization. We followed it up second with the social risk and looking at all the challenges around social equality and what transparency means and what the potential risks are to your organization around ESG and how to report on that and how best to support that. And today we're going to be concluding our webinar series around ESG and risk in the enterprise with the focus on governance. So really appreciate you joining today. We are taking questions in our question and answer box. So please, if you do have any questions during the session, please put them there and we will answer them as soon as we can. Joining me today, of course, like the other two, is Michael Rasmussen. I'd like to welcome Michael to today's call. Michael, you want to do a quick intro?
Sure. I'm Michael Rasmussen. My job is research. I'm an analyst. So got 30 years overall experience in this market of governance, risk, and compliance. 21 of those years as an analyst, 7 at Forrester Research, and 14 now on my own. So my job is really understanding and doing research and interacting with organizations on what keeps them up at night in context of governance, risk management, and compliance. And of course, that brings in ESG, today's topic, and how they go about solving those GRC and ESG challenges with strategy, process, and technology.
Excellent, thank you. And I am our offering manager for ESG here at OneTrust, and we've been focusing on, of course, the full areas of reporting around ESG, identifying risks, putting together risk libraries and controls, as well as opportunities within ESG for your organization to be successful and how to support your programs. And we'll talk a little bit about some of the tools around that at the end. But first today, we want to focus on really kind of the current state of the G in the ESG and what that means. There's certainly broad definitions out there on governance, and this is one that is very well known and maybe one of the most mature areas in the space, but at the same time is still changing all the time. We'll also look at any governance challenges that we think are part of what you need to approach and how you're going to deal with them. Some of the enterprise ESG risks around governance, and then some tips around building a strategic plan, some guidelines around that, and of course we'll take in the final finish up with some questions. So when we think about kind of governance, a couple of things I want to start off with here. One is that as it relates to sustainability, governance requires a committed leadership. It requires clear direction. It really requires influence, and that's really coming from the top down. And so governance, which we say defines here, measures and reports the culture and behaviors of the organization, as that relates to sustainability, really good governance is going to foster things in a company, including sustainability. And so that's why it's really important to have that clear direction from the top down. It's going to be very difficult to have that company-wide influence when you're working from the bottom or in a specific business unit. And so a company's values and their support of good governance, it's really key to the success of ESG. And how that's being done, it's not going to be done and accomplished the same way at every organization, right? There are many different pieces of governance, some that we've listed here and different areas you need to look at. But each organization is going to have their own needs, their own requirements. But governance really promotes accountability of your organization, transparency, efficiency, and guidelines, policies on how you can go about and perform some day-to-day activities, and gives that clear direction to everybody within the organization around what the priorities are. It really ensures stewardship for the environment. And stewardship, includes kind of protecting, conservation, management of natural resources. So when we think about governance and the environmental piece, those are all key things. And stewardship is becoming more and more important to organizations as they think about kind of their long-term impact here. Same thing on the social side. Governance promotes equality. The transparency around that really helps with supporting individuals within a company to do their best and to be successful. And of course, there's a lot of pieces here and risks that we see around corporate governance, whether that's potential fraud or anti-bribery and corruption issues, information security and corporate data, the behavior, as I mentioned, equality. All these things are all important governance, and we'll touch on each of these things and many of these things and some of the risks involved in that. But hopefully that defines kind of governance for you and kind of some of the key things that we'll be covering today.
I was just going to add there, Phil, that when you look at the ES and G, and we were discussing this a little bit, you and I, the environmental side of the E has a lot of diversity across industries. The environmental program at a bank is going to look different from a petroleum company, for example. And S, there's more consistency, but there's a lot of variety across industries as well. The G, when you look at those different areas that we've tackled there's a lot of similarity. The G the ES and the G has probably some of the most common roots and elements across industries, where there's more variation by industry in the E and the S.
Yep, and certainly some of those vary by the maturity of the company, the size of the company too. I would say though there is some differences in the structure and how they're putting those together. So
almost definitely, yeah.
Yep, one of the more mature areas.
So today's environment is an interconnected risk environment. The physicist Fritjof Capra stated, the more we study the major problems of our time, the more we come to realize that they cannot be understood in isolation. They are systemic problems, which means that they are interconnected and interdependent. The physicist was talking about biological ecosystems, but it applies to governance and risk in the organization today. We cannot have just a siloed view of things anymore because it is an interconnected risk environment. And as the organization is focused on trying to reliably achieve objectives as a governance function, we need to see the intricate relationship of all these different risks and objectives, that we can't just understand them in isolation, but we have to understand them in context of the organization. So the ESG culture of your organization, whether it's across the E, the S, or the G, but we're focused on the G, at the end of the day, it's about the integrity of the organization. I see a lot of chief ethics and compliance officers, particularly being handed the accountability for ESG, and they're becoming more the chief integrity officer. But whether we're focused on the E, the S, or in today's webinar, the G, it's about that integrity. What the organization communicates in its code of conduct, in its accounting practices, in its diversity and inclusivity, and all these different matters of anti-bribery and corruption and security and privacy, is it a reality? Is what the organization communicating to the world smoke and mirrors, pretending to be something else? Or is it the reality of what the organization really is? When it comes down to the G and ESG, and we look at all these different processes and policies and practices of the organization, the whole focus here is, are we honest with ourselves? When we look in the mirror, does this reflect what the organization is really about? I teach a lot of workshops on policy management, and I've got a code of ethics on my laptop here that back in the year 2000 was the model code of ethics. Everybody was copying it to be their code of ethics and code of conduct. In fact, I had a petroleum company in Canada that came to my workshop in Minneapolis before the pandemic that said, we nearly copied that code of conduct word for word to be our code of conduct. I'm talking about Enron's code of conduct. It was a great, well-worded code of conduct, but it wasn't reality. Enron had a lot of governance issues, a significant amount of fraud. And because of Enron's governance issues, it led to Sarbanes-Oxley, which we've been struggling with for the last 20 years. But that's my whole point here, is what we communicate in our policies, our ESG practices, our values, our ethics, our code of conduct. Is this a reality in the organization? Does it reflect who we really are?
And one thing I'd add on that too is that companies need to be proactive there and not as reactive, right? And so what I mean by that is, an integrity is, what you're doing when someone's not looking. And so it's one thing to, pretend to be someone else, which is also, which is wrong, but also to not care about it until you're caught. And so it's really important for you to be proactive in your policies and your models around, your governance and what you're doing, and not wait until something bad happens before you kind of address it.
Definitely. So In that context, we have here the ABC model on corporate culture. And this comes from some work I've done. I'm an honorary life member and global ambassador of risk management for the Institute of Risk Management out of London. And about a decade ago, we did this work called Risk Culture, Resources for Practitioners. But I love using this model because it's so relevant in the organization today. The attitudes down in the trenches of the organization, as well as with management, they shape the behavior of the organization. That behavior, in turn, forms the culture of the organization. That culture then influences further attitudes and behavior. And so this is very important when we talk about governance, the G in ESG, because we're really getting down to the attitudes, behavior, and culture of the organization in context of fraud and bribery and corruption and all these things. What's being allowed? What's the attitudes, the behavior, and focus of all these? And so as we govern the organization, we need to be able to guide and nurture culture. Culture is really interesting. Corporate culture can be completely destroyed overnight in an instant. You know, something bad comes out about executives or the organization, and all of a sudden it can take decades to repair. I mean, right now, if we thought of things like, you know, child labor and supply chains, you know, I'm sure some brands come to mind. If you think about fraud and corporate wrongdoing, of course, I mean, I just mentioned Enron, you know, some brands come to mind. You know, culture can be destroyed overnight, but it can take literally years to decades to repair and shape. And so culture is extremely important from a governance function to nurture and make sure it's going in the right direction of the organization and address the negative and wrong attitudes and behavior before it really forms that culture in the organization.
Are there any indicators, Michael, that you would kind of look at when it comes to companies' attitudes? You know, I one time put together we called it an enterprise personality profile, and it was a test that companies could take to identify different things. Are there any specific attitudes around this, especially in governance, you know, that are good, some that are bad? Anything that you would point out?
I mean, could we do a Breyer Miggs profile? Like, you know, I'm an INFJ company.
That's exactly what it was. We were able to profile a company and help identify their strengths and their weaknesses based upon, you know, the way the company's actual actions occurred, not kind of what they said they were doing.
That's interesting, because I had a blog article I did last spring, and that's on my website, and asking, what is your organization's alignment? You go back to the 1980s, and I played a lot of Dungeons and Dragons, and you created a character, and you had to choose your alignment, which you could have a lawful good character, which is like the virtuous knight that always does right, obeys every rule and every policy out there, is out there for the greater good. You can have a lawful evil, you know, type character, which could be like a Darth Vader type person, you know, which is evil, but still works within all the rules and things of the empire. Or you could have a chaotic evil type character with like the Joker and Batman, where anything goes, destruction is rampant and things. And so I had this whole blog article that translated all that to, like, you know, what is your organization's alignment? Are you that lawful good organization, a neutral good organization, a chaotic good organization, a lawful evil, lawful good, or, you know, but, you know, it gets into some of that personality as well.
Well, that's interesting. And would you say a lot of that is being driven by the top down, by kind of the executive leadership and the way that, you know, they're focused on the market and how to be successful in their business? Or is it something that is kind of driven throughout the entire organization and it becomes part of the core of the organization?
Well, I think that gets in this next slide. It's measured at all levels. ESG cultures, and particularly governance, is measured at all levels. We hear that term tone at the top. And that is very true, because that tone at the top really guides and instills behavior all the way down. But we also have the actions down at the bottom. You know, what's happening down there in the trenches, in the front lines of the organization, that defines culture, as well as that overall tone and behavior in the middle. I mean, culture is measured at all levels. We can dissect it from the top, the middle, and the bottom of the organization, but culture is influenced by all levels of that. But to have a strong culture, it's got to be reflected in leadership. There's no doubt about it. So tone at the top, I mean, some people get tired of hearing that term, but it is absolutely essential, because it's the leadership that sort of defines what that culture is, and people follow suit with that.
Yeah, and going back a few slides, like you said, it has to be about the actions, not just the words. And so, you know, we've probably all worked through companies and have examples at companies where there are a lot of, words around certain policies and things, but the actions didn't necessarily commit to that. Maybe, some things around, number of meetings that you might have, and, policies around length of meetings, et cetera. And then everybody was always late to a meeting, and the meeting never started on time, and meetings always ran over, and people didn't respect other people's time, which is a pretty common thing. And so, it's one thing to have policies and to have a kind of view around that in words, but it's really about the actions of the leadership, of the management team, that gets portrayed down to everybody there, and filters out. And so it has to be more about kind of what you do and not just what you say. And that's really, I think, a big part of good governance.
It certainly is. And so this brings us to this slide. This is like one of my most popular slides I've ever created, one of them. The organization has to be able to see the tree as well as the forest, that individual ESG risk, as well as the interconnectedness of ESG risks and the objectives of the organization. The tree and the forest. Now, what's interesting is I presented on this slide in a lot of my workshops around the world, and I've actually been challenged on it twice, once in San Francisco, once in London, both before the pandemic, and both were by large banks, and they said the exact same thing, different banks in different workshops. They said, great analogy, but the reality is that it's also about the branches and the leaves. That it's not just the tree and the forest, but those details, those individual transactions that might lead up to bribery and corruption or fraud or money laundering under governance. Those little things matter. It's like the chaos effect in chaos theory, or the butterfly effect in chaos theory, where you have the butterfly's wings in the Netherlands makes tiny atmospheric changes that has this cascading and growing impact that can influence the development and path of a hurricane in the Gulf of Mexico. Those little things matter. Those transactions and things in the accounting systems that indicate fraud, money laundering, bribery, corruption, or the behavior of those individuals within management that might lead towards harassment, discrimination, those little things matter. And so it's not just the risk itself, but it's all those elements that pour into the risk as well.
Yeah, and I think that's a great point. And the challenge, though, is that, we've seen, even through the news or, the past few weeks about, harassment challenges at large companies, even with all our, rules and policies, our, morals that we have, and our, more and more increasing transparency, that these things are still happening. This is big. It's still very common, from top down at different organizations, whether it's sexual harassment or inequality or harassment and abusive behavior. All these things are still going on, even though companies, I think pretty much, everybody understands in this day and age that, that's not the way that work gets accomplished and that people perform the best. And so that really drives organizations and more growing global regulations and requirements, because if companies can't self-regulate, then they're going to be regulated. And so we've certainly seen, regulations to try to enforce this in a global sense, either those coming out in the US, like Dodd-Frank Wall Street reform, and Dodd-Frank, with conflict minerals, of course, the longstanding Consumer Protection Act. NASDAQ has, created a diversity disclosure requirement that if you're listed on NASDAQ, and so it's an annual disclosure requirement about diversity on your board, and others, will follow suit. Some, like the NICE, of course, are waiting to see what the SEC in the U.S. will pull together and what their requirements will be, which is expected any week or any day now. But more requirements around governance and around disclosures are certainly emerging. And there are guidelines like the ISO 31000, risk management, and then the 37001 anti-bribery management systems. Different regions, different countries, have some of their own. So we definitely see this as a growing need. And again, if companies can't self-regulate, so more and more they're going to be regulated, and they're going to be required to have disclosures and to put out reports around their status in these areas.
Most certainly. And I think one of the interesting things on this slide when we were discussing it is we just threw a couple things out there, but the reality is if we really tackled every different country's legislation and regulation, and also the international standards, and even get down to state or provincial requirements as well. I mean, this would be an eye chart. We'd have 4-point font out there, and it'd just be cluttered with all the different types of regulations that pull into the G in ESG.
Yeah, absolutely. So I guess the bottom line there is that it's going to be more and more of a duty, right, and an assigned role, if it isn't already at your organization, to do this report out, because I think that's a growing need. Like you said, whether it's state, whether it's local, whether it's national, whether it's international standards, there's just more coming in the space. So please also add your questions in. I see a question from Arjan around safeguarding as part of governance. Sure, absolutely. You know, when we think about stewardship and protection, right? Safeguarding, if that's what you're referring to, is no doubt a big part of that too, as we had mentioned. Again, please add any questions in. We'd love to take your questions as we're going along. All right, so thinking about kind of a strategic plan. So we kind of laid out the groundwork around kind of what the challenges are, what are some of the current and emerging regulations and requirements that are going to be in that space. So what should companies be doing and thinking about when they're building a strategic plan? Of course, first defining policies, right? Processes and resources. That's always a part, first part. Where do you start with that, Michael? Where's the best place to start with this?
For me, the way I approach it, it always starts with policies. Policies are the foundation of how we're going to behave in the organization. To me, policies are governance documents. In fact, I've interacted with Starbucks as well as Suncor Energies in Canada. Both of them call their policy management program their governance documents program. The reality is that policies are governance documents, and because they help us reliably achieve objectives, and they're there to govern the organization. So if we're talking about the G in ESG, it starts with those governance policies. What are we trying to do? What is the behavior of the organization? And from those policies, we then define, and policies aren't just governance documents, they're also risk documents. Every policy itself has identified a risk. There wouldn't be a policy if there wasn't a risk, and that risk was significant enough that we had to write down some type of policy to be able to address that risk. Every policy is a risk document, and most organizations have even mapped their policies to the risks. A lot of organizations don't even know what policies they have, but policies are critical: governance documents, risk documents, and integrity and compliance documents. And so it starts with the policies and defining and guiding those from the code of conduct on down into the accounting policies and board policies and everything else. And from those, you can start to define controls and processes and metrics to monitor.
Now, of course, policies kind of tell you the what to do type of a thing, right? So what are you doing? What's your day-to-day? When you think about kind of the strategy, though, is that something that comes after the policies, or should you think about the strategy, along with the policies and kind of?
Well, I mean, technically, policies are the first step in the operational piece of it. The strategic piece of it sort of has to even come before the policies, because it's in the strategic piece of it that we sort of define what those values and commitments are. What type of organization are we? Are we a lawful good, lawful neutral, lawful evil organization? I mean, that's part of the strategy, that even before you write your policies, you have to really understand who we are, what our values are, what we're trying to achieve, because that's going to be reflected in the policies.
Mm-hmm. Are you seeing more organizations actively writing those out? And if they are they also publishing those? Are you seeing more of these strategies, or at least the policies that they're going to guide, or at least their principles, becoming more and more published internally and externally too?
I mean, policies and principles definitely are being published, and publicly traded firms have to publish their code of conduct, for example. But particularly around ESG, we're seeing a lot of ESG reporting out there.
Yep. And so this is becoming more and more a big part of that. There's no doubt about that. So another area in this piece, right? So you have your internal policies and your strategies. How does that affect what you're doing with your supply chain? Is supply chain something that should be a consideration? Those supply partners, are they also part of the policy? Are they someone you include in that, and incorporating that, and kind of how do you do that? Like, what's the best way?
Yeah. Well, your mother always told you that you are really defined by what friends you keep. The truth is, that's where business is today too. Our businesses are defined by the extended enterprise. The idea of brick and mortar business and traditional business boundaries and traditional employees, that doesn't exist anymore. The modern organization is the extended enterprise. It's a network of third-party relationships. And so when we look at the organization, it doesn't start and stop with traditional boundaries. It is an extended array of nested supply chains and subcontracting relationships that all form, and it's not black and white, it's shades of gray where the organization starts and stops anymore. And so this defines the organization, so we certainly have to do due diligence and communicate. You look at things like bribery and corruption, U.S. Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. FCPA is firmly under the G in ESG. Same with the UK Bribery Act. There's CEP and DO in France and others. All more of those regulations you can put on that one global map a few slides back. But when you look at FCPA enforcement actions from the Department of Justice and SEC, the bulk of them, around 80% of them, involve third parties in some way that were involved in the bribery and corruption scheme. We definitely have to address the supply chain, the third-party relationships, extended enterprise, whatever you want to call it. We have to address them, whether it's the E, the S, or the G. All three pour into this. There are those supplier, vendors, outsourcers, service providers, their IT security issues under the G, they're your IT security issues. Their privacy issues are your privacy issues. Their fraud and bribery and corruption issues are your fraud, bribery, and corruption issues.
Yeah, I guess the question that comes up frequently on this is, well, how far back do you go, down that supply chain? Do you go to your suppliers, their suppliers, and then, a lot of companies, because, they could be large companies, they have thousands, tens of thousands of suppliers. Maybe, they have the top, 100 or 1,000 that provide them 80% of what they need, and then they have 9,000 suppliers that provide them, very small percentages, things here and there. So I guess the question that comes up quite often is like, how far back do you go? And then, do you just address your biggest suppliers and the ones that have the most impact, or are you, looking at everybody in your supply chain?
And that's something for the organization to determine in its own risk profile and what level of risk any supplier brings and how far down the supply chain or nested subcontracting relationships we want to go. But at a minimum, organizations should get some type of attestation that their first level of suppliers and vendors and third parties, that they attest to and acknowledge the policies of the organization, and that they're doing the same for their suppliers and third parties that are involved with the organization as well.
I think this is also a good point where you've created your own code of conduct and your own principles to make sure that those are shared with your suppliers too. And then we see there's a lot of organizations that are looking to provide incentives to align. And so if we think about the environmental piece, if you're creating your environmental policies and your strategies there, and you want to work with your main suppliers and align your own strategies with them, because as Michael said, if you don't, right, you're only as good as your weakest supplier there, and so those will still bring those risks. So even if you're providing good environmental or social practices, but your suppliers aren't supporting things like equal pay or fair pay in a region, then that's something that's still going to be impactful to you. So I think a good best practice here is to make those requirements known and be very upfront around those with your suppliers, and as you said, to whatever level you need to go to, but you really need to do that. And I guess the last thing that I'll just kind of throw out here too is, what's your thought on assurances in this space? Like, it's one thing to say, okay, to your suppliers, we see this, this is what we want, this is what we are expecting. Let us know, here's an assessment. Let us know what you're doing in this area, right? Which is common, but what's the thought on assurances? That also comes up quite a bit. Having assurances in the space.
Certainly. The minimal assurance is getting some type of attestation from your suppliers and even the facilities. I worked with one global Fortune 100 company that it was required some type of attestation, not just from the supplier, because they had 5,000 suppliers, but from each facility for the supplier, because they had 20,000 facilities in their global supply chain. So one supplier might have one facility, another supplier might have 10 facilities. And so they were getting attestations from each facility servicing them. I know one bank that is actually requiring attestations around privacy and things like that, down to the individual contractor or individual third-party employee that's working in their data centers. But at a minimum, you need some type of attestation. Now, when it comes to areas of governance, I've also seen people tier things when it comes to on-site inspections and audits. So like high-risk suppliers or third parties might have some type of on-site inspection on an annual basis. Moderate risk suppliers that have that bring some moderate risk to ESG might have an on-site inspection every 2 years, while low-risk suppliers or third parties are randomly sampled. So maybe out of a 20,000, maybe 50 are randomly sampled for on-site inspections or audits, if you have a right to audit clause in your third-party contract. But those are some best practices. A lot of people are far from that.
Yeah, for sure. It's interesting, with the pandemic, of course, going on, those on-site inspections have really kind of slowed down. They're doing some Zoom inspections, but those don't get the same level of transparency, with the Zoom inspection, because you still have to point a camera somewhere, and that could be easily planned, versus the on-site inspections. It's a lot harder to cover some things up if you're trying. So that, I think I've heard too that's been a bit of a challenge during the pandemic time. All right, next, thinking about monitoring. So we talked a little bit about that. With any additional thoughts around monitoring and some of the key aspects here?
Now, monitoring is an interesting one, because you have your internal monitoring to be able to understand our governance policies and how they're being followed in the organization, and the hotline and whistleblower system, and what type of complaints, investigations, which ones are substantiated, and how's the organization responded. I mean, there's a lot we can pour into there, but there's also monitoring of the extended enterprise we were just talking about as well, and that can get into monitoring a lot of news sources, and to get third-party risk intelligence and other database sources for watch lists, sanction lists, politically exposed person lists, negative news, and so many other aspects as well.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. Just looking through some great questions that are coming in. Thinking about some of these. Let's look at this. Kind of related to what we're talking about here. One question came up: how do companies, compliance officers, so where compliance officers will be a big part of these different areas we're discussing, how do they get companies to conform or stick with various policies within ESG? I think we mentioned some things around, of course, having the monitoring and attestations. Any other thoughts around some of the best practices for compliance officers and how to use some of these strategies?
It's going to require a team effort. When you look at ESG, or you just look at just the G, there's a lot of departments involved. And so compliance and ethics might lead ESG as far as the ultimate accountability for the reporting, but there's going to have to be strong relationships with the accounting department. There's going to have to be strong relationships with senior management and the internal audit function. There's going to have to be strong relationships with IT security and legal, because all these have different aspects in that G of governance. And so, to me, whoever's leading ESG, whether it's corporate compliance and ethics or some other role, sometimes it's like herding cats. But you've got to be able to get these other roles to be able to work together, collaborate, share in a common vision, but also in commitment to the policies and values of the organization.
Yeah, well, that's great. Charmaine asked a question around, maybe does it make sense in, not just having compliance officers, as we mentioned, but ESG specialists in organizations versus, kind of the board kind of driving a lot of this. So are you seeing more ESG specialists, governance specialists? Is that becoming a role also at organizations?
That's where a lot of times the chief ethics and compliance officer is the lead ESG specialist on the integrity of the organization. But there's a lot of domain specialists, so what we call subject matter experts out there as well. And they might get very specific. You might have a subject matter expert in a very large organization specifically on bribery and corruption and dealing with, the dozens of bribery and corruption laws around the world. You might have another subject matter expert that is there for tax transparency and substance management and things like that. You might have another subject matter expert that's the expert on security or privacy, because you can have the overall encompassing ESG type subject matter expert, but the ESG and even the G itself is so broad that one person can't have all the depth and detailed knowledge of every aspect of it.
Yep. Vishal asked a little bit around kind of, well, what are some of the incentives for companies to instill ESG? And of course, I think we talked about that, how to eliminate risk, or reduce your risk, I should say, about being transparent, to your different stakeholders, to drive better business, to be a better steward, right? To potentially, and it's been shown that those companies that are reporting on ESG, especially public companies, are doing better with investors and in the markets. Customers want to buy from companies that are being transparent and that are providing information and that are providing resources to do better in the environment or in their social worlds. So lots of incentives for companies, and today most of it and much of it is voluntary. But we know that that's changing, as we mentioned. Lots of regulations coming down this path. And then one last question before we move on is Teresita asked some of the metric examples for reporting, and someone had asked around different frameworks, and when we showed some of the regulations. And so there are, in the ESG world, there are some more broad-reaching frameworks. GRI is one that came up and was asked about, and it's a very broad-reaching that covers the ES and G. SASB also covers a lot of the ES and the G. And so these are reporting metrics and frameworks, some that are industry specific, some that are a bit broader and more horizontal, that kind of give you good guidelines and metrics that you can use, and that are typically kind of internationally adopted metrics and standards for reporting around the ES and the G. So there are some more industry specific examples that you may have, in whether it's retail or whether it's in real estate, healthcare. They have some different guidelines. Financial services may have some different guidelines too, but generally there are some very broad ones that are mentioned that you can definitely use. Whistleblowing is a topic that comes up a lot, and those of you familiar with it, it's really about going beyond just the hotline. So creating a hotline for your employees to provide information around wrongdoings within the organization. You want to create a trusted environment, and certainly whistleblowing is a big piece of that. You want to look at things around case management. You want to be able to put together the principles and guidelines around what's right and what's wrong. And of course, there's big changes coming with regulations here with the EU whistleblowing directive. And so we see more and more organizations that are getting more proactive in this piece, and that it's becoming more and more expected, not just because of regulations, but that organizations have some type of hotline or helpline around a lot of different subjects that may come up, whether it's harassment, individual, whether they see wrongdoings going on, and give them an anonymous and secure way of doing those reports. It's becoming more and more important. Any additional thoughts around whistleblowing piece, Michael?
I mean, this is a big and growing critical area. I mean, whistleblowing has been a hot topic for 20 years since Enron and WorldCom and Sarbanes-Oxley within the United States. We've seen a lot of press release in the last couple of years on the SEC's whistleblower awards, where they get monetary compensation for blowing the whistle. But we're also seeing this pick up a lot in Europe with the new EU regulations and requirements around whistleblowing. This has to be in place. Good governance means that you have to have a speak-up culture where people can express their concerns and that they are investigated and followed through on.
Yep, I agree 100%. And then finally, we mentioned a little bit on reporting and disclosures and some of the ESG standards and frameworks that are out there. We didn't talk too much about frequency, how often these are done, and a lot of them, are annual reports, but certainly we're seeing that move more towards quarterly updates on those, and also even some companies doing, real-time updates, posting information on their websites around this as it becomes more and more important. Anything else to add on that, Michael?
Yeah, reporting can take a lot of time and effort if done in manual processes with documents, spreadsheets, and emails. I was talking to one firm that was spending 200 hours to build a report on compliance and integrity for the board of directors. And it was going through all the investigations and hotlines and whistleblowing, everything we were just talking about. 200 hours to build one report because, again, they had to sift through tons of documents, spreadsheets, and emails. They implemented technology for this. It now takes them less than a minute. For going down from 200 hours to a minute to produce the report. That's a significant delta. And when you're trying to aggregate reporting that's done in a lot of documents, spreadsheets, and emails, you're going to make mistakes. That's the other thing they found. After 200 hours, we had a lot of mistakes when audit looked at things because there's miscalculations and the aggregation of figures and things, because that much time spent with that many scattered documents and things, there's bound to be errors. Yep,
and what we see also is a lot of manual processes in place versus, automating the integration of your data, the analysis of your data. Companies could be looking at hundreds of metrics, using email and cut and paste to try to organize all that becomes a challenge. A lot of the information that you have within governance and ESG is spread throughout your organization. And so you're not just going to go to one person and get all the information. You're going to have to put all that together. And that's where a lot of the time really takes place. And then, most organizations have very limited resources in supporting, these reporting and disclosures, and limited number of those that are involved. And so, yeah, there's no doubt that tools are becoming more and more critical, not just around the reporting, but also for the analysis of the information that you're getting, the metrics, the risk identification. All those things are becoming really important because things are so widespread. And kind of brings us to the next section. So thinking about some of the tools for the governance, thinking about ESG, and this becomes like a top-down approach. I think we kind of talked a little bit, right? You start with your strategy around ESG, as we had mentioned before, and where the management process is, what is the organizational chart, where does it all sit? And then what we're seeing is the bottom two pieces become a big challenge, is ESG management of information, and then the technology to kind of support all that. Of course, management processes and organizational things also become issues, because this doesn't just, begin and end and then start again in the next year. This is ongoing, and then people change, regulations change, all these things change. So these processes become, a bigger challenge because of things like lack of issues around or issues around continuity. And so what we've seen also is a lot of organizations, they don't have a continuity, and so it feels like they're always starting over every time they want to come out with anything around this. Technology can help that with some of that continuity. Any additional thoughts on this, Michael?
Yeah, I mean, it all starts with strategy. And to me, that means getting the right team in place, and who's going to lead the ESG strategy, whether that's corporate compliance and ethics with the chief ethics and compliance officer or some other role in the organization. But who are all the different departments that are going to be part of the ESG strategy? Because there's different departments for governance, there's different areas for environmental and social. But just under the governance alone, I mean, you're going to have IT security, you're going to have accounting, you're going to have audit, you're going to have legal and things. And so what different departments and functions are involved? And if you're talking about a cross-department strategy, across enterprise strategy, that means you're probably going to have some type of charter in place that this committee can work together. And what's the charter for establishing this committee? Because you have different departments working together. And then what's the overall goals for reporting and monitoring and accountability structure? So that once you have that strategy in place, you can then define your processes that might get into your policies and your reporting and your metrics and what's going to be gathered, and then determine the information technology architecture that can funnel in and support and automate and make the strategy and process more efficient, effective, and agile in the organization.
No doubt about that. And of course, you mentioned this, but understanding a lot of what these ESG strategy drivers are, right, it'll be an important piece. Around what's the, specific to your industry and to your business, and what's the impact and what the potential risk could be around that, what will derail your strategy, process improvements and visibility. And then, of course, we've been focusing on a lot of the governance, on the collaboration pieces, making sure that a lot of this is really organized, what your executive sponsors are, what the matrix looks like and what the expectations are, and kind of what's needed. And so a lot of different pieces of the strategy that can be put in that. And then it looks like you have a process you put together around kind of addressing ESG on this?
Yeah, I mean, you have to, it just sort of unfolds what we were just talking about, establish that accountability and reporting structures as part of that strategy. And, in that process, developing the policies and processes, communicate and train on those policies and processes, assess the ESG risks within those policies and processes. And then from there, you leverage technology for that communicate and assess, but also that monitoring and reporting. And then you remediate the issues that you find as they spring up in the organization in the G context or in the E and the S context.
Yep. And then, do it all over again. I mean, this isn't something that ever stops. It's something that's just a continuous piece.
And that's what is challenging about this, but also to me exciting, is the world is dynamic. Organizations are dynamic. There's mergers and acquisitions. There's new risks that we have to address and things out there. Like we've been dealing with the pandemic for the last few years, but then all the elements of the pandemic, like, the supply chain backup and things, and all these impact governance, reliable achievement of objectives. And, the world is not a static, like boxed in organization where everything's the same every day. And so this has to be a continually evolving process.
Yeah. And so new risks also coming out all the time. And so you've been referring more to the idea of this ESGRC. So applying kind of the GRC model to ESG and where as in ESG space, the risks aren't necessarily as fully well developed as in some of the other areas. Like there's a lot of high level risks that people understand out there, risk to infrastructure, risks from the environment and climate change, risk to social unrest, but they haven't really fully defined those as much. So what's your thinking around kind of this OSIG GRC capability model within ESG?
To me, this is what puts it all together, what we can call ESGRC, the G being the linking element. The ESG, for the most part, is about reporting. It's about the values and things operational of the organization. But when people talk about ESG, they're talking about like GRI reports, SASB reports. But a lot of the ESG guidance doesn't necessarily tell you how to do it in the organization. That's where I feel the GRC capability model takes it practically into the organization that can roll up into the ESG reporting that the organization needs. It starts with learn, which you understand your external context of the regulations and the environment and the risks you're working in, your internal context of how your organization is structured and its values and the culture of the organization and the stakeholders that are involved in ESG. From there, you align, you work together, you provide direction for ESG, you define the objectives of the ESG program, you identify and assess risks to ESG, and you design your program. But after you align across these different departments, you then perform. You implement ESG-related controls and policies. You communicate and educate the workforce and the extended enterprise on those policies and controls. You provide incentives for doing the right thing, as well as disincentives for doing the wrong thing. And then you provide rather proper notification pathways like whistleblowers and hotlines we talked about. You provide inquiry for assessment as well as response when issues are identified. But then you have to continuously review, you monitor the environment for changes in ESG and provide assurance with the audit function on ESG, and you improve your ESG program over time. That's the OSIG GRC capability model applied to the ESG context.
No, that's great. And obviously monitoring is a big part of that, right? And you have to look at your internal and external context for what's that impact going to be on ESG. And I think the challenge here is that, you can see there are a lot of different monitoring points, a lot of different, challenges that companies need to listen out for and to be a part of. Any thoughts around like how to prioritize that, or what are some of the best practices in kind of monitoring in this space?
Monitoring is going to look different depending on the size of your organization, number of jurisdictions, and global breadth of your organization, the industry of your organization, and so much more. Monitoring and what to monitor for a global bank is going to look different from like a regional manufacturer that's just in the United States, because there's different regulations and enforcement actions and industry practices, and there's different geopolitical risks depending on the breadth of the organization. So there's a lot of variance in this depending on the type and size of the organization.
Yep. Are companies using some third parties for this too? Are they?
They definitely are. I mean, they're using consulting firms that aggregate this information. They're using a lot of geopolitical risk firms, regulatory intelligence, and regulatory aggregators. Other types of feeds like negative news, and then on the third party side, watch lists, sanction lists, politically exposed person, reputation and brand lists. There's a lot of different feeds that can come in, particularly for the external context.
Yep, obviously very common. And of course, a big use case and example here is the use of like Twitter, for instance, as kind of like a real-time monitoring for your own company. That's at least probably the first level companies should be looking at, scanning that and seeing, what's coming out and any new opinions and other things that are coming out there. So that's something that's become more and more common also. Some thoughts around keeping ESG policies aligned with culture. There was actually kind of a question that came out around this too, maybe a good time to address from Sandro is, he asked, why is it difficult to create a culture of change in managers and align with ESG principles and how that kind of impacts them? So I guess, first of all, is it a challenge? Are companies seeing that it's a challenge to align culture with kind of the financial goals of an organization? And, how is that being resolved?
It can be a challenge. I mean, in corporate culture, it has a direct impact on this and how open and agile the culture is versus how rigid and stuck in the way we've always done things. When I talk to individuals on this matter, you can almost break people up into thirds. There's a third that, or organizations up in thirds too, but there's a third of the individuals I talk to on an ESG strategy. It's like, I get this, I'm committed, I'm onto the values and things, we need to drive forward at this. There's another third that it's like deer in the headlights. It's like, this isn't, I don't understand this isn't what I've been trained on. This is something new to me. I don't get it. And then there's and that part doesn't bother me because that's just education with that third. But the final third, those are the ones that I get really frustrated with, because they're the ones that say, I've been doing my job my way for the last 20 years. This is the way I do things. I'm not changing. It's that type of individual or department that can be really frustrating to work with.
Yep. Yeah, and Rex asked a question around this too. So are there specific soft skills that an organization should bring to the work environment around this? Any specific things in those areas that might be helpful?
To me, it's whoever's leading the ESG strategy has to have a lot of charisma and the ability to collaborate and work with the other departments and break down barriers.
Yep. I think listening is an important part of that, as a soft skill, to understand what are priorities for the organization, and not just to the leadership, but to different stakeholders, whether, not just your own company, but maybe your partners, also your customers, and employees, are important. So I think that listening piece is really good. And then I think another part is setting a vision, right? I guess, if that's, kind of mentioned here, your mission, vision, values, but, I think giving a vision of what could be, because I think in many people, it's hard for them to see that and see where that direction's going and what the impact will be. So I think, those are definitely, two important soft skills, in this area that will, help, companies to be successful. So kind of bringing it all together, lots of different pieces of it.
Yeah.
So we covered a lot of this. So, some of the tools and kind of, how OneTrust can help in this area, right? We have our different offerings, that we can bring out, and, within the offerings, we have all the different areas that kind of collapse together to support, that kind of bringing it all together, whether it's, the ethics and where the whistleblowing may sit, whether it's the reporting around ESG, in our program management piece, whether it's around, privacy of your data and your information and how that's being managed. Of course, everything within your governance, risk, and compliance, and what you're doing, internally with your IT risk, and then through Vendorpedia with your vendor risk management. And so, a big piece of that is getting your data in, right? Having that data discovery, having that updated, up to date, and then automations that are be part of this too. So built right into the platform that can automate, risk flags and help you identify, different levels of risk, and all be able to be customizable and configurable to your own organization. I think Michael talked a lot about how important that is across different industries and around different organizations, size of organizations, maturity within your organization, the strategy of that organization. All those things are key. And then,
can I say something there?
Sure, of course.
On the previous slide, what's interesting is OneTrust. I mean, Phil, you have that one slice of the pie that talks about ESG, and that's great. But the reality is all these elements that OneTrust delivers pours into that green ESG piece of the pie right there. Because, I mean, your Vendorpedia, the OneTrust DRC, data governance, privacy, preference choice, ethics, these are all elements that are important to gather information for that piece of the pie of ESG.
Absolutely. So that's why we believe kind of a platform approach is important, because ESG sits in all these different elements, right, too, or vice versa, as you were saying. And so even though there is a specific ESG offering, right, it's very, very broad, and there's all these different components to it. So it's becoming more of a challenge for organizations to have these different point solutions, because they need to exchange information across all these different elements. And that's why a platform becomes really key. And even within ESG, we're covering areas of program management, so around your reporting, your carbon management and accounting, helping with, understanding where your emissions are coming from, and of course, how to reduce those, thinking about your supplier management, so supplier sustainability and that responsibility around what your suppliers are doing, because you are responsible for their actions also. Things around investor portfolio and ESG management, so helping to understand sustainability and investments, and thinking about companies that have investments, that's their suppliers in many ways. They've got investments in companies, and they need to understand what their impact is, and they're responsible for that. and then kind of aligned with, environmental health and safety systems, things like incident reporting and environmental management. All those things are really key across the platform. And we see kind of growing needs, and we'll be bringing out new capabilities across these different pieces today. Helping you get that reporting, as Michael said, there could be 200 hours or more around kind of putting these reports. And so we see companies taking 3, 4, sometimes 5 months to create just a single report. And some companies that are doing, multiple reports in this area, multiple different standards and frameworks that they're adhering to. So that's why we think it's important to kind of centralize your ESG data, be able to kind of bring that data across different metrics and across different frameworks to make it easy for you to fill out that information and report on that information, be able to track from year to year, from day to day, and be able to monitor that with kind of real-time dashboards and customized dashboards that allow you to kind of see what's most important to you, see those different risks that may be emerging and how to remediate those, and have a continuity overall, right? Having a central location that gives you a continuity of having that information. So every time you're doing a new report, you're not starting over from day one. And we think that's going to be a critical piece. The next step on that is how you take action on that. So even though reporting is an important element, it's not the end of what you're doing. You need to take actions around the different programs that you have to make improvements, identify kind of your baseline, identify your carbon footprint, but then what are you doing to help reduce and offset that carbon footprint? And so, the platform that we have kind of provides you that insight and information, be able to take action and make intelligent decisions that are going to be impactful to your business, right? To help you drive an informed ESG strategy. We have an information capability today with a site on data guidance that has, we call ESG IQ, policy and framework research, regulatory changes and updates, industry compliance and requirements. All of this is free. You can actually go there now. So go to dataguidance.com and click onto the ESG piece, and a lot of our ESG information is there. Again, giving you guidance, best practices, community, actionable insights around your ESG program and how to improve on that. So if you need some more information, we have a few different areas and locations you can get to have some of that information and help you kind of, again, improve your practices and improve your ESG program. Someone asked we have a couple minutes left. We can just cover maybe some quick questions. This presentation, this webinar will be available on our website in probably the next week or so. And so the deck will be on there and the webinar will be on there, so you can easily see that. I guess, as that, any final things, Michael, you want to say as we sign off?
No, I think we pretty much covered it. And so if you combine all three of these webinars together, it gives you a great overview and perspective of ESG and how to approach it. And of course, as a research organization, I'm here to answer questions as well. I'm happy to interact with anybody.
Well, I want to thank you, not just for today, but, for all the work that we do together on this. I've learned a lot, during these webinars, and I think we've opened up some really interesting areas, and I hope that's been useful for our audience. So again, thank you for everybody for attending. We really appreciate it, and we'll be talking to you again soon. Have a great day.